Welcome back. This is Linda again for the third video in this series about congregational vitality and next steps. I'm sharing with you this PowerPoint, and I'm hoping that you're following along in the workbook, and that in the workbook you have just talked about the different blocks in the Jenga tower and which ones are your strong ones and which ones are the weaker ones and where is your attention going. Now what I'd like to do is ask you this question. When you look at this tower, we assume that a strong, big, sturdy tower is good, and that a tower that's weak and falling over is bad. But the truth is that's not always the case. I want to push on that a little bit, and I want to use the analogy of seasons. Everything in this world has seasons. We know that from Ecclesiastes, but we also know it from just everyday life. We have seasons of the calendar, and we have longer cycles that happen in nature and in society. So for example, we have a tree. Let's take a vital, healthy tree. It's going to look really different in the summer than in the winter. If you look at it in the summer, it looks alive and full and strong. And if you look at it in the winter, it looks kind of dead. It's not any less vital. It's just adapting to what's going on in nature, and it actually uses each of those seasons to do something new in itself. Likewise, if you look at longer cycles in nature, you have well, I'm here in the Rocky Mountains, and so here we have a meadow, a lovely meadow, and the sun comes down and there's lots of grass. But then there comes a time when the aspen come in and they grow up and they shade the meadow, and now the grass dies, but now it's an aspen forest, so it's healthy, but it doesn't look the same as it did when it was just a meadow. Now as an aspen forest, the shade gets so thick that now new aspen can't even come up, but what can is the pine trees. And so the pine trees come up and they grow even taller than the aspen and they create shade. Now the aspen can't grow, and now we have a pine forest. What happens then? The pine forest oftentimes will catch fire, and then it looks like death and decimation, but guess what? It's not. Those pine cone seeds are released, and the cycle starts over, and we have another meadow. That cycle isn't an annual one. It takes hundreds of years to complete, and yet each of those times has a time of health that looks really different than the previous times. And so that's called an adaptive change cycle. It's used a lot in nature to talk about how nature moves, but it's also used to talk about civilizations, coming and going of empires, coming and going in just sociological changes. And it's just kind of how society moves. It's also been applied to the church. In this case, it's been applied by Roxborough and Romanek. They use this very familiar figure 8 cycle. So it starts here in the case of a congregation, when a congregation says, this is who we are and what we're about. Earlier I used the example of a Swedish immigrant congregation around the turn of the last century. They came here, they spoke Swedish, they brought their pastor over from Sweden, and they started a church for the Swedish people in that community, okay? They built on that church for a long time, on that identity, and it worked for a long time. But as new generations come along who maybe don't speak as much Swedish, who maybe don't really even identify so much with the culture from the homeland, those same things they did before don't make sense anymore. And they get into this time where for a while, they're trying to hold on to those ideas, but eventually they need to let them go. And then that's what we call the crisis. That's when they hit a point of saying, this is not working. Are we ready to let go of who we've been and maybe embrace something new and different? We don't know what yet, but we're open to it. And that's when we enter this new cycle down here. It starts with confusion, but it slowly becomes clear. And then a new choice becomes available to them. So that's generally the cycle that congregations go through in their whole lifetime. There's kind of these 3 phases. So there's a phase of building on who we are. There's a phase of escaping our understanding of who we've been to open up our minds to imagine who we could be now in the future. Now this cycle happens in congregations in big and small ways. And that's kind of the interesting thing about adaptive change cycles. They aren't just one size fits all, okay? So the top one here is the slower cycle. Remember how earlier in nature we talked about the meadow changing to an aspen grove changing to the other thing, right? All of those interact. If you're an aspen tree born in the meadow, At first, you're going to have a hard time. If you're an aspen tree born when it's an aspen grove, you're going to do great. If you're an aspen tree trying to be born when it's a pine forest, you're going to have a heck of a time because there's not enough sunshine, right? Kind of the same thing in congregations. So if you're a congregation that started off strong and you know who you are and you're building on that, that's going to be the foundation of how shorter, faster cycles happen. So for example, you have a pastor leave, and you want to hire a new pastor, you're going to hire one that was kind of like the old pastor because you know who you are, and that's going to remember who you are, and that's going to inform this next level, the congregation seasons. Congregations go through seasons for a number of reasons. A lot of times it's because of change in pastoral leadership, but it can also be big events in the life of a congregation, or sometimes a big crisis. A congregation has a flood or something wipes out the building, that would trigger a big change in their life. But you can see that in that case, how the state of the overall congregation is going to influence the state, how they transform through that crisis. So let's take that example. You have a congregation that's strong and sturdy, knows who it is, and is building on that, and a flood wipes out the building. What are they going to do? They're going to rebuild because they're going to remember who they are, and they're going to start over again. Now, let's take that same congregation and say they're not really sure who they are anymore because what they've been doing isn't really working anymore the way it used to. And they're at this question time. They're wondering, should we go on? And if so, why? And when they're wondering that and the building gets wiped out, now they have a chance, right? Because any innovations they were trying here, they could rebuild in a completely different way. Maybe they'll merge with another church, right? They'll launch into this bottom edge based on what they're learning here in the congregation season can inform what's happening here. Same thing at a faster pace down below. You might have youth programming. You may have a youth minister, and at one point the youth minister decides to leave. Well, if you're in the middle of a pastorate and you have a strong leadership team, you're probably going to just hire another youth minister who's, the same as that last one. And then if, however, you're maybe in the middle of a pastorate change, you may decide, well, we've been doing some experimenting in our youth ministry. Maybe we don't want to hire just another youth minister. Maybe instead we're going to launch into more creative time and let that creative time of trying maybe a youth ministry with another church, or maybe we'll use volunteers, or maybe we'll use an associate pastor instead. All that's going to inform different ways you approach your congregation season. And if you're in a vulnerable time as a congregation, that can then inform your whole congregation's approach to ministry. So I'm hoping this is explaining that these things can cascade down and up and influence one another. So there's times when your congregation's more open to change and influence that's radically different, and times when it's really just going to be tweaking what it's always done. So that's kind of how I want you to understand this. Now I want you to go back to your workbook, which I'm going to share here on the screen again. And you're going to go here to page 4. And think about your congregation's life. How were you founded? And actually the questions I'm asking here are on the next page, on page 5. So think about your original founding narrative. Talk about how your mission and your original narrative continues to inform who you are today, and kind of mark where you are on this chart today. And then talk about how your congregation has moved through it in the past, and what's been helpful and not. So go ahead and take a look and pause the video, actually stop the video, and then you'll pick up on the next one in the next video. Thanks.